Okay, well, let's recall what we've seen so far from Romans 1:19 and 20. Just by analyzing that text, we had four questions. And as a result, we came up with four answers. What we had was real knowledge about God's nature that is communicated through all created natures and understood by human reason, such that any reflection on this knowledge of God through lesser natures will be a natural theology. But there's a lingering objection, and it could be seen in various ways. But the way that we're introduced, the way that we introduced this was to show that some modern commentators and architects of new methods for apologetics, in the case of Van Til, or new methods for theology as a whole, in the case of Barth, that these commentators and theologians were uneasy with the content of natural revelation having any objective status through the medium of discursive reasoning. That was the big no-no, discursive reasoning. At the moment you think about this revelation, that moment it's tainted by autonomy, remember? So I think what we can do to maybe get people's heads around this is maybe try to reason with our friend by starting to frame their objection for them and allow them to end the sentence. So we can say, no product of discursive reasoning is what? Not true natural theology? I don't think a Van Tillian would want to say that, because remember, Van Til affirmed a redeemed natural theology, and that requires discursive reasoning. In this case, just for the believer. So what? How do we want to end the sentence? Well, what we find especially in the Van Tillian case is this. I think this is how we can say it. No product of discursive reasoning that does not follow from a scriptural presupposition is true natural theology. Now, to cite another Romans commentator, Cranfield, quite a famous Romans commentary, but he also denied that Paul intended or even allowed a natural theology by these words. Instead, the meaning is that, and this is Cranfield's words now, quote, men ought to have recognized, but in fact have not recognized. Men ought to have recognized, but in fact have not recognized. And so the question as to the ground of inexcusability seems not to have troubled that commentator. Now, if by recognize Cranfield wanted to suggest a hearty agreement with the facts of natural revelation, that the unbeliever sees and agrees with it and is consistent with it in all respects, well, then we would agree with Cranfield that it's not recognized in that sense. Sinful man doesn't do that. But even the fullest denial of those facts by sinful man cannot be a denial of that which is wholly unrecognized, can it? So the normal meaning of the word recognized is very different than the way Cranfield was treating it here. And so that's how we would meet those lingering objections. But let's move on from there, because J.V. Fesco is one who's recently addressed this idea of inexcusability. And so he's looking at this in the context of Van Til, of course. He says, but according to Van Til, this natural knowledge was solely for the purpose of rendering sinners inexcusable, though Van Til does not adequately explain how this natural knowledge functions to bring about their inexcusability. Moreover, and now this is not Fesco but me, but the same sufficient condition of the guilt, if that's there, it suggests a necessary condition to the gospel. What we're going to see is that you actually need this for various things. And the first thing we want to look at, as in terms of things that you need this for, is the gospel itself. For example, in his book, The Clarity of God's Existence, Owen Anderson puts it in this way. He argues that if the failure to know God, unbelief, is inexcusable, culpable ignorance, then it must be clear, readily knowable, that God exists. This means that it is necessary for God's existence to be clear, readily knowable, in order to make sense of the Christian claim that unbelief is culpable ignorance and requires redemption. Now, I'm not sure I got that whole quote on that slide there. I left off a part. But that is the whole quote, and it's an interesting point. That attribute of general revelation, its clarity. What does that, or does it not, tell us about the role of discursive reasoning? Now, I said by way of introduction that the connection between this clarity and this guilt is real objective knowledge, right? And we have seen, or what we have seen, is that Paul moves us in Romans 1:20 really beyond the knowable in Romans 1:19 and 20. Remember the whole question of what may be known versus that which is known, and which is the latter was the better translation. He moves us beyond the knowable to the known, the objectively known. And this can't be merely capacity. It can't merely be intuition, because for the mind to possess objects of knowledge requires reason. Not just as a faculty, it requires reasoning that's been done. And so this is the classical position that was expressed, for example, by Augustine. And here's that quotation by Augustine. Notice that Paul, this is in Augustine's work on the Spirit and the letter, he says, notice that Paul does not call them ignorant of the truth, but says that they held the truth in iniquity. And he does not fail to answer the obvious question, how could those to whom God had not given the law have a knowledge of the truth? For he says that through the visible things of the creation, they reached an understanding of the invisible things of the Creator. So if the clarity of God's existence is an essential property of natural revelation, what follows then for natural theology? Well, simply put, and this is what I was alluding to before, what follows is that natural theology is always happening when anyone thinks about God. It doesn't matter what realm it is, what realm of theology. It's true of apologetics encounters. It is true of putting doctrinal ideas together in your constructing dogmatic theology. And it is true even when you are exegeting the text of Scripture. And that's what I'm representing by that Venn diagram there, that natural theology, that which is known about God, take your pick. I mean, if you say that it is impossible that an immutable being should have an addition to his knowledge or something like that, that truth will be true in all three of those realms. That truth will be true whether a believer utters it or whether an unbeliever utters it. You say, well, the unbeliever doesn't mean the same thing. You're changing the subject. The proposition in itself is objective knowledge. Again, let God be true, though everyone were a liar. Our thoughts can be right or wrong to varying degrees. But even that which is wrong will be borrowing from a whole set of correct premises that are conceded and which therefore have been reflected upon. You can't have these things in your mind unless you've reflected upon them. Not things at this level. And at the very least, the coherent presentation of the gospel hinges on a proper exegesis of Romans 1:20 at exactly this point. We could say it like this: if inexcusable, therefore they deliberately mishandled the clear. Let me say that one other way. If inexcusable, therefore they deliberately, discursively mishandled the clear. They can't suppress it in unrighteousness. They can't exchange the truth for a lie if they don't do so discursively. It doesn't make any sense. Now, for the purpose of systematic theology, which is where I'm going to drive all of this and my whole thesis, we could put this in the following language. Some true knowledge of God from nature through reason is a necessary precondition to loci such as theology proper or soteriology. It's really every section of systematic theology, but we'll just start ourselves off easy. especially, we just mentioned the gospel, but we'll see it with theology proper as well, because after all, most directly, it is the knowledge of God, and we'll see that in various ways. We'll have a chance to draw that out. So I'm not going to do it here, because before demonstrating that connection, we really have to have a working knowledge of other biblical texts that support what we've looked at from Romans 1:19 and 20. They support the objective knowledge of God from nature through reason. So let's visit another famous text on general revelation, and that is Psalm 19, 1 through 6. Psalm 19, 1 through 6. And we'll read it. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. Now, some will suggest that glory there, of which the whole earth is full, in passages like Isaiah 3, for example, would at least mean the same thing. And I think what happens here is you bounce back and forth between passages about the glory of God as we really generalize that. We don't think specifically about what that means. But let's just say it in a very simple way. The glory of God at least means great things about God. You could speak about its radiance. It's the sense in which it excels, the sense in which is the sum total of God. And you could ask questions like, well, how is he glorified? And glorification, intrinsic glory versus extrinsic glory. But however you divide those up, the glory of God at least means great things about God. So because this isn't a poetic genre, unlike Romans 1, there's all sorts of things that you can do to avoid the obvious here. In his answer to Eunomius, Gregory of Nyssa argues, looking at Psalm 19, from the obvious poetic sense of the psalm, to the conclusion that God did not speak in the physical sense of having a mouth or projecting sound waves. Now, what is he doing? He's refuting a wooden literalism about Genesis 1 that happens to be his subject matter. It was set forth by his opponents, and so he's borrowing from Psalm 19 to make his points. Now, you can see that, but you can make another mistake, because conversely, the words of the psalm also cannot be reduced to mere poetry. You say, well, it's poetry. Take that into account. True, but it's not mere poetry. I've heard people say before, you can't take doctrine out of the Psalms, which is ridiculous. You just have to do it according to its proper literary genre. But the idea is that mere poetry. And so maybe it could just lend itself to the innate knowledge of God alone, and that's what's happening here. But declarative speech is always communicating content, so that to begin thinking about it at all is to consider it by discursive reasoning. This is true whether or not one has written it in a standard propositional form. Even if you're just thinking about it, you are thinking about it. And one would think that this is especially true about the kind of truth that is spoken of by the psalmist here. Again, would anybody seriously defend that there is from birth an innate knowledge in the stars and in the mountain or in a baby's cry or so forth? Well, that would make sense because that's innate. Or intuited later on, that knowledge is intuited about the stars or the mountain range or the baby's cry. In other words, in and of themselves, that phenomena, any phenomenon in the heavens, it doesn't contain any data that could intelligibly count as theologically conclusive. No, there's a reason. The reason is what you would give to anybody who asks, like 2 Peter or 3:15 tells you to do, or 1 Peter 3:15. A reason. If somebody says, but why? Why did I see Psalm 19? I see your claim there. Why does the brilliance of that star suggest anything about your particular God? And likewise with the endurance of the mountains, or with the new life of the infant. Any of these things we would say, well, that's wisdom or that's power or whatever. But if somebody says, well, why? Where do you get that from? You wouldn't, nobody, unless they were being belligerent or obtuse, would answer, false. That is my reason. In reference to the bare phenomenon, the sound waves, the light of the star, or whatever else. Because that would be no reason at all, but more like a reason that one does not have to have a reason. So it's very important to query the sense in which we're saying that this is data. What is data? Okay, we're really talking about reason there. Okay? Well, Calvin weighs in on Psalm 19 as well, that the psalmist is giving us the logic of a design inference, really. And he does that through discursive reasoning. Here's how Calvin says it. David shows us how it is that the heavens proclaim to us the glory of God, namely, by openly bearing testimony that they have not been put together. Sorry, there's the quote right here. David shows us how it is that the heavens proclaim to us the glory of God, namely by openly bearing witness or testimony that they have not been put together by chance, but were wonderfully created by the Supreme Architect. When we behold the heavens, we cannot but be elevated by the contemplation of them, to him who is their great creator. You see that? When we behold the heavens, step one, we cannot be but elevated by the contemplation of them. Start with the data. We see things in the world. Next step, we are elevated by the contemplation. You're thinking from the things in this world to him who is their great creator. You know, it kind of sounds familiar, almost like Thomas's 5 ways. Think about those words. Elevated by the contemplation of them. What else does that mean but that discursive reasoning is the avenue that God has designed for the objective communication of his truth to increase in our minds? Well, it's not just Calvin, Matthew Henry as well. Matthew Henry weighs in on Psalm 19. He says, he talks about what that is which the creatures notify to us. That's kind of his heading. They are in many ways useful. In other words, these things in the creation. They are in many ways useful and serviceable to us, but in nothing so much as in this, that they declare the glory of God by showing his handiworks. Verse 1. They plainly speak themselves to be God's handiworks, for they could not exist from eternity. All succession and motion must have had a beginning. They could not make themselves. That is a contradiction. Now, you might be tempted to say at that point, okay, I know where you're going, but all Henry's doing is he's giving his own commentary on that data. He's not suggesting that data, he's not suggesting that the heavens and that glory is actually something that you or whoever makes that same reasoning process. Henry's making the reasoning process because he's a Christian. Well, read on. They could not be produced by a casual hit of atoms. That is an absurdity, fit rather to be bantered than reasoned with. Therefore, they must have a creator who can be no other than an eternal mind, infinitely wise, powerful, and good. Thus it appears they are God's works, the works of his fingers, Psalm 8:3, and therefore they declare his glory. From the excellency of the work, we may easily infer, and this is where I think it gets clearest in Henry's quote. We may easily infer what? The infinite perfection of its great author. From the brightness of the heavens, we may collect that the Creator is light. Their vastness bespeaks his immensity. Their height, his transcendency and sovereignty. Their influence upon this earth, his dominion, and providence and universal beneficence. And all declare his almighty power, by which they were at first made, and continue to this day according to the ordinances that were then settled. So here we have a commentary that takes for granted the normalcy of thinking about what one is beholding in general revelation. The older thinkers did not shy away from that. Natural theology is not some forced appendage to the boundaries of natural revelation. It is simply the currency of doing any business with it at all. So that's Psalm 19, quick treatment. And what we're going to do next time is we're going to start to look at really all the rest of the verses, but we'll pay special attention to Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, and we'll see that natural theology contains the substance of natural law.